The air conditioning unit at the Copperhead Lounge was fighting a losing battle against the Arizona summer. Located on the outskirts of Kingman, just off the historic Route 66, the bar was a refuge for locals trying to escape the 110-degree heat and travelers whose cars had overheated on the long stretch of desert asphalt. Inside, the air was thick, smelling of stale lager, lemon polish, and the faint, dusty scent of the desert that managed to seep through every crack in the walls. Maya wiped sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand, her other hand balancing a tray of dirty glasses. At 24 she felt 40. Her uniform was a size too big, her apron was stained with grease from the kitchen, and her feet throbbed in shoes that had lost their arch support months ago. She had been working since 10 in the morning, and it was now past 8 at night, covering a double shift because the other waitress had called in sick again. The bar was moderately busy, filled mostly with regulars, mechanics, retired railroad workers, and a few truckers passing through. They were generally a quiet bunch, nursing their beers and watching the baseball game on the mute TV above the bar. Maya knew she was working hard to pay for community college classes, and generally left her alone, tipping a few dollars here and there when they could afford it. However, the atmosphere had shifted an hour ago when a group of 5 men walked in. They were out of place in Kingman, dressed in expensive polo shirts and clean work boots that had clearly never seen a construction site. They were contractors from Phoenix, in town to survey land for a new solar farm, and they carried an air of superiority that filled the room like a bad smell. They had pushed 3 tables together in the center of the room, dominating the space and demanding constant attention. In the far back corner of the bar, in a booth that was usually empty, sat a man who was the polar opposite of the loud group. He was alone, nursing a bottle of beer that he hadn't touched in 20 minutes. He wore a heavy leather vest over a black t-shirt, the death head patch of the Hells Angels clearly visible even in the dim light. He had a thick beard, graying at the temples, and sunglasses resting on the table next to his hand. The biker, whose road name was Hawk, sat with his back to the wall, facing the door, a habit born from decades of living a dangerous life. He wasn't looking for trouble. In fact, he was just passing through on his way to a run in Nevada, stopping only to cool down his engine and his blood. He sat in absolute stillness, a dark statue in the corner, observing everything but interacting with nothing. Maya approached the contractor's table for the 5th time in 20 minutes. The leader of the group, a man named Brad, with a sunburned face and a loud, braying laugh, snapped his fingers as she got close. "Hey, sweetheart, where's that pitcher? We're dying of thirst over here," he shouted, ignoring the fact that she was the only server on the floor. "It's coming right up, sir," Maya said, keeping her voice polite despite the grit in her teeth. "The keg blew. I had to change it myself." She tried to smile, but her exhaustion made it look more like a grimace. She placed a bowl of pretzels on the table, hoping to appease them. "Change the keg? Isn't that a man's job?" one of Brad's friends joked, nudging the man next to him. They all laughed, a sharp, cruel sound that cut through the low hum of the rest of the bar. Maya felt her face flush, not from the heat, but from the casual sexism that she had to swallow for $2.13 an hour plus tips. She walked back to the bar, feeling the eyes of the locals on her. They looked down at their drinks, embarrassed but unwilling to intervene. These men were spending money, buying top-shelf whiskey and rounds of shots. And in a struggling town, money often bought silence. The owner, sitting in his office in the back, wouldn't kick them out as long as the credit cards cleared. As Maya poured the pitcher, her hand slipped slightly from sweat, and a splash of foam hit the counter. She cursed under her breath, wiping it up quickly. She could feel the vibration of the bass from the jukebox, which the contractors had loaded with loud, obnoxious rock music that didn't fit the vibe of the room. She picked up the heavy pitcher and a stack of fresh glasses. As she walked back out onto the floor, she glanced at the corner booth. The biker hadn't moved. He was looking at his phone now, seemingly oblivious to the chaos. Maya felt a pang of disappointment, though she didn't know why she expected anything different. In her experience, nobody saved you. You just had to endure. She reached the table and began to pour. Brad watched her, his eyes critical and predatory. He waited until the pitcher was almost empty. Then he suddenly shifted his elbow, knocking into her arm. It was a deliberate move, disguised as a careless gesture. The remaining beer sloshed out of the pitcher, spilling onto the table and splashing onto Brad's expensive boots. "Whoa. Watch it," Brad yelled, jumping up and knocking his chair back. "Look what you did, you clumsy idiot." The bar went quiet. The music seemed to fade into the background. Maya stood frozen, the empty pitcher dripping in her hand, staring at the wet boots. I'm so sorry, sir. You bumped my arm, I didn't mean to. I bumped you. You're blaming me," Brad shouted, stepping into her personal space, using his height to intimidate her. "You're incompetent. Look at this mess." He gestured to the table, his face red with fake outrage. He was enjoying the show, enjoying the power trip of belittling someone he viewed as beneath him. Maya looked around the room, her eyes welling up. The regulars shifted in their seats, looking uncomfortable, but nobody stood up. Nobody said a word. The silence was deafening, a heavy blanket of complicity that weighed on her shoulders. She was alone. Brad wasn't finished. He saw the fear in Maya's eyes and took it as an invitation to dig deeper. He wiped his boot with a napkin and threw the wet paper onto the floor at her feet. "Clean that up," he sneered, "since you're so good at making messes. Maybe you can figure out how to use a rag." Maya trembled, her hands shaking so hard the plastic pitcher rattled against her hip. She wanted to scream, to throw the pitcher at him, to walk out the door and never come back. But she thought about her tuition bill due next week. She thought about the rent on her small apartment. She needed this job. "I'll get a towel," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She turned to walk away, her dignity hanging by a thread. She felt small, invisible, like a piece of furniture that had malfunctioned. "Yeah, go get a towel," Brad's friend chimed in, laughing. "And maybe get someone who knows how to do the job while you're back there." The group erupted in laughter again, high-fiving each other as if they had just won a major victory. Maya reached the bar and grabbed a rag, her vision blurry with unshed tears. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her heart rate. She had been yelled at by customers before, drunks, angry truckers, confused tourists, but this was different. This was targeted. This was cruel for the sake of cruelty. She walked back to the table, kneeling on the hard, dirty floor to wipe up the beer. It was a humiliating posture, on her knees at the feet of the men who were mocking her. Brad watched her, sipping his whiskey, looking round the room to ensure he had an audience for his dominance. "You missed a spot," Brad said, pointing with his toe near her hand. "Right there." "God, are you blind too? No wonder you're working in a dump like this." Maya scrubbed the floor, biting her lips so hard she tasted blood. "I'm doing my best, sir," she choked out. She stood up, holding the dirty rag, just wanting to retreat to the safety of the kitchen. "Your best isn't worth much, is it?" Brad said, leaning back in his chair, crossing his arms. He looked her up and down with a look of pure disgust. "Honestly, you're pretty worthless. Can't pour a drink, can't clean a floor. What are you good for?" The word hung in the air, worthless. It echoed in the silence of the bar. It was a word that cut deeper than any curse. It stripped her of her humanity, reducing her to a function she had failed to perform. At the bar, Old Man Miller, a regular for 20 years, gripped his beer glass tight. He looked angry, his jaw working, but he was 70 years old and frail. He looked at the younger men at the table, intimidated by their size and their aggression. He looked down, ashamed, unable to find the courage to speak. Maya stood there, taking the abuse, her spirit breaking. A single tear escaped and rolled down her cheek, leaving a clean track through the dust and sweat. She didn't wipe it away. She didn't have the energy left to hide her pain. "What? Are you gonna cry now?" Brad mocked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Oh, boo-hoo. Do you want a tip? Here's a tip. Get a different job. You're pathetic." The cruelty was absolute. It was a display of power that relied on the silence of the room. Brad felt invincible. He had the money, he had the status, and he had the floor. He turned to his friends, grinning, expecting another round of applause for his wit. But the applause didn't come. Instead, a sound came from the back of the room. It was a singular, sharp sound, the screech of heavy wooden chair legs scraping against the floorboards. It was loud, deliberate, and it cut through the tension like a knife. Maya looked up. Brad stopped smiling. The regulars turned their heads. In the corner booth, the Hell's Angel was standing up. He didn't rush. He unfolded his large frame slowly, like a predator waking up. He adjusted his leather vest, the movement causing the heavy leather to creak audibly in the quiet room. He picked up his sunglasses from the table and slid them into his pocket. He didn't look at the door. He didn't look at the bar. His eyes were locked on the group of men in the center of the room. Hawk took a step forward, his heavy boots thudding against the wooden floor with a rhythmic, heavy cadence. Thud, thud, thud. He walked with a purpose that made the air in the room feel thinner. He wasn't walking to the bathroom. He wasn't walking to the exit. He was walking straight toward Brad. The distance from the corner booth to the center of the room was only about 30 feet, but Hawk made it feel like a mile. Every step was a statement. He was a large man, standing well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that filled out his cut. His arms were covered in tattoos that were faded by the sun and scarred by the road. As he approached, the atmosphere in the bar shifted from uncomfortable silence to terrified anticipation. The Hell's Angel's patch on his back, the colors, carried a weight of history and reputation that everyone in Arizona understood. It meant he operated by a different set of laws. It meant he wasn't afraid of the police, or lawsuits, or men like Brad. Brad, who had been so loud a moment ago, watched the biker approach with a look of dawning realization. He saw the Arizona bottom rocker on the vest. He saw the 1% diamond patch on the front. His grin faltered, then vanished completely. He sat up straighter, trying to regain his composure, but his eyes darted nervously to his friends. His friends, sensing the shift, had stopped drinking. They put their glasses down quietly. The arrogance that had fueled them seconds ago was evaporating, replaced by the primal instinct to avoid a predator. They shrank in their seats, suddenly finding the patterns on the tablecloth very interesting. Hawk stopped exactly 2 feet from the table. He didn't say a word immediately. He just stood there, towering over them, blocking out the light from the overhead fixture. His shadow fell across the table, covering the spilled beer and the terrified men. He looked at Maya first. His expression was unreadable behind his beard, but his eyes were calm. He nodded once, a small, subtle gesture that said, "I see you." Then he turned his gaze to Brad. The silence stretched out, agonizingly long. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator and a distant rush of cars on the highway. Hawk stared at Brad with an intensity that was physically uncomfortable. He was dissecting him, analyzing him, measuring the man's worth and finding it lacking. Brad tried to speak, his voice cracking. Can we help you, pal? He tried to sound tough, but it came out as a squeak. He grabbed his beer bottle, holding it like a shield. Hawk ignored the question. He reached out slowly and plucked the beer bottle from Brad's hand. He didn't snatch it. He just took it, as if Brad were a child who wasn't allowed to hold it. He set the bottle down on the table with a soft clink. You got a lot to say, Hawk said finally. His voice was deep, a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. It wasn't loud. He didn't need to shout. It was the voice of a man who never had to repeat himself. We're just having fun, Brad stammered, sweat beading on his forehead, just blowing off steam. It's a free country, right? Fun, Hawk repeated the word, tasting it. He looked at the wet floor where Maya had been scrubbing. He looked at the tear track on her face. You think making a woman cry is fun? You think that makes you a man? Brad's friends looked away, distancing themselves from their leader. They wanted no part of this conversation. Hawk's presence was like a gravity well, pulling all the attention and danger in the room toward him. She spilled beer on me, Brad said defensively, pointing a shaking finger at Maya. It was an accident, but she ruined my boots. Hawk looked down at the boots. They were designer work boots, pristine, except for a dark spot. Then he looked at Maya's shoes, worn-out sneakers held together with duct tape. The contrast was stark. Accidents happen, Hawk said. Disrespect. That's a choice. He leaned in closer, placing his hands on the table, leaning his weight forward. The wood creaked under the pressure. You called her worthless, Hawk said softly. In my world, you don't use words you can't back up. You insulted her. You insulted this house. And you interrupted my drink. Brad swallowed hard. Look, I didn't mean anything by it. It's just talk. We're leaving. We'll just pay the tab and go. He reached for his wallet, his hands fumbling. Hawk's hand moved faster than Brad could blink. He slammed his hand down on top of Brad's hand, pinning it to the table. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room. Brad flinched, gasping in pain as the heavy rings on Hawk's fingers dug into his skin. We aren't done yet, Hawk said. You don't just pay with money. Maya watched, mesmerized and terrified. She had never seen anyone stand up to men like Brad. She expected violence, a punch, a brawl, the kind of chaos that usually followed bikers in movies. But Hawk was doing something more effective. He was dismantling Brad's ego piece by piece. Please, Brad whimpered, trying to pull his hand back, but Hawk's grip was like iron. You're hurting me. Am I? Hawk asked, his face stone cold. You like hurting people, don't you? You like making people feel small. How does it feel? He squeezed harder, just for a second, then released the hand. Brad cradled it against his chest, rubbing the red marks. You're going to apologize, Hawk stated. It wasn't a question. To her. And you're going to mean it. Look at her. Brad hesitated, his pride warring with his fear. He looked at his friends, but they offered no support. He looked at Hawk and saw only a promise of pain if he refused. Slowly, he turned his head toward Maya. I'm sorry, Brad mumbled, looking at her apron strings. I didn't hear you, Hawk said, leaning back and crossing his arms. And neither did the rest of the room. I'm sorry, Brad said louder, his face burning crimson. He looked up at Maya, hate and humiliation in his eyes, but the words came out. I shouldn't have said that. It was wrong. I'm sorry. Maya nodded, stunned. She didn't know what to say. She just clutched her rag, feeling a strange mixture of relief and vindication. Good, Hawk said. Now, the mess. He pointed to the puddle of beer on the floor. She isn't your maid. You made the mess. You clean it. Brad's jaw dropped. You want me to? On the floor, did I stutter? Hawk asked. He took a step back, giving Brad room. There's the rag. Get to it. The humiliation was complete. Brad looked at the dirty rag on the floor. He looked at his expensive pants. He realized he had no choice. Slowly, painfully, he slid out of his chair. He got down on his knees, just as Maya had done minutes before. He picked up the rag and wiped the floor. The silence in the bar was heavy, but now it felt different. It wasn't the silence of fear. It was the silence of justice. The regulars watched with grim satisfaction. Old Man Miller nodded his head slowly. Brad wiped up the beer, his face hovering inches from the dirty floorboards. He finished and stood up, dusting off his knees, his face a mask of shame. He threw the rag on the table. "Are we good?" Brad asked, his voice shaking with suppressed rage. Hawk looked at the table. "You drank top shelf, you took up space, you ran your mouth." He looked at the bill sitting on the table. "Leave your wallet." "What?" "Leave the cash." "All of it," Hawk said. "Consider it an inconvenience fee, for the lady. And for the house." Brad didn't argue. He opened his wallet and pulled out every bill he had, hundreds, fifties. His friends did the same, terrified that they would be next. They piled a stack of cash on the wet table. It was hundreds of dollars. "Now get out," Hawk said, dismissing them with a wave of his hand. "And don't stop in Kingman again." The men scrambled. They didn't walk, they practically ran. They bumped into each other in their haste to get to the door. Brad was the last one out, casting one hateful look back, but looking away immediately when he met Hawk's gaze. The door slammed shut behind him, leaving the bar in a ringing silence. For 10 seconds, nobody moved. Then, the tension broke like a fever. The regulars exhaled collectively. The music, which had seemed to stop, filtered back into their consciousness. Hawk stood by the table for a moment longer, ensuring the threat was truly gone. And then he picked up the stack of cash. He didn't count it. He didn't put it in his pocket. He turned to Maya. He held the money out to her. "For your tuition," he said simply. Maya stared at the money. It was more than she made in a month. I can't take that. It's robbery," she whispered, looking at the door. "It's a tip," Hawk corrected her. "They paid for the service they received. Take it." He pressed the money into her hand. His hand was warm and rough, callous against her skin. "Thank you," she stammered, tears welling up again, but this time from gratitude. "You didn't have to do that." "Someone had to," Hawk said, looking around the room. He cast a glance at the regulars, the men who had sat and watched. He didn't say anything to them, but the look was enough. They shifted in their seats, looking down at their beers, ashamed. They knew they had failed a test that Hawk had passed without blinking. Hawk turned and walked back to his booth. He picked up his empty bottle and brought it to the bar, placing it gently on a coaster. He pulled a $20 bill from his own pocket and placed it next to the bottle for his own tab. "Stay safe, Maya," he said. It was the first time he had used her name. He had heard the other customers use it. He turned and walked toward the door. Onk. The sound of his boots was the only sound in the room. As he passed the tables of the regulars, Old Man Miller lifted his glass slightly. It was a small gesture, an acknowledgement of respect. Hawk didn't acknowledge it. He just kept walking. He pushed the door open and stepped out into the sweltering night. The heat rushed in for a second before the door closed. A moment later, the deep, thunderous roar of a Harley-Davidson engine erupted outside. It revved once, loud and defiant, shaking the window panes. Then the sound faded as he pulled onto the highway, disappearing into the dark desert. Inside, the atmosphere had changed completely. The shame of the locals was palpable, but so was a sense of relief. Maya stood in the center of the room, clutching the money. She wiped her face, stood up straighter, and looked at the door. One of the truckers cleared his throat. "Miss Maya? Can I get another round, please?" he asked, his voice unusually polite, "and take your time. No rush. Coming right up," Maya said. Her voice was stronger. She wasn't the invisible waitress anymore. She was the one the angel had protected. And that meant something. By the next morning, the story had spread through Kingman like wildfire. In a small town, news travels faster than the wind. At the gas station, the diner, and the hardware store, everyone was talking about the night at the Copperhead Lounge. "Did you hear?" they whispered. A whole crew of Phoenix contractors, scared senseless, cleaning the floor on their knees. The story grew with every telling. In some versions, there were 10 bikers. In others, Hawk had thrown Brad through a window. But the core of the story remained the truth. A man with a patch had done what the polite society refused to do. He had defended the dignity of a working woman. When Maya arrived for her shift that afternoon, the mood was different. The owner, a man named Frank, who usually ignored her unless he was complaining about costs, greeted her at the door. "Heard you had a rough night," Frank said, looking awkward. I should have been out there. I was in the office. I didn't know it got that bad." Maya looked at him. She knew he had heard the yelling. He had chosen to stay in the office because he didn't want to lose the tab, but she just nodded. "It's handled, Frank." "Right. Well," Frank shifted his weight. "You take the front section today. Keep the tips, and if anyone gives you trouble, you come get me." "Okay. Okay," Maya said. She realized he was afraid, not of her, but of the shadow that now stood behind her. The legend of the Hell's Angel had cast a protective circle around her. The regulars came in as usual, but they treated her differently. There were no crude jokes, no snapping fingers. They looked her in the eye when they ordered. They said, "Please and thank you. Old Man Miller left a $20 tip on a $4 coffee. For the other night," he mumbled when she picked it up. "Sorry, kid." Maya realized that Hawk hadn't just taught the bullies a lesson. He'd held a mirror up to the town. He'd shown them their own cowardice, and now they were trying to make up for it. She worked her shift with a new energy. Her feet still hurt, and the heat was still oppressive, but the weight on her chest was gone. She touched the pocket where she kept the cash. Hawk had given her enough to pay off the semester. That evening, a group of young men came in, loud and rowdy. They started banging on the table. Maya walked over, notebook in hand. She didn't flinch. She didn't look down. She looked the leader in the eye. "Welcome to the Copperhead," she said, her voice firm. "We have rules here. Treat the staff with respect, or you can drink somewhere else." The young man looked at her, surprised by her confidence. He looked around the room and saw the serious faces of the regulars watching him. He saw the way Maya stood her ground. "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly. "Just a pitcher of light beer, please." Weeks turned into months. The summer heat began to fade into the slightly cooler desert autumn. The story of the Hell's Angel at the Copperhead Lounge became part of the local lore, woven into the fabric of the bar's history. Brad and his crew never returned. The solar farm project went ahead, but the contractors stayed on the other side of town, eating at chain restaurants, avoiding the dusty bar on Route 66. They had learned that in the desert, money didn't make you a king. Maya finished her semester with straight A's. She kept the job, but she walked differently now. She wasn't the victim. She was the survivor. She'd learned that her worth wasn't defined by what people said to her, but by what she tolerated, and she tolerated no disrespect. Hawk never came back. That was the way of the road. He was a nomad, a spirit of the asphalt who appeared when needed and vanished just as quickly. Maya scanned the crowd sometimes when the door opened, looking for that black leather vest, but she never saw him. She kept the memory of him, though. Not as a savior who rescued a damsel, but as a teacher who reminded a forgotten town about honor. He had shown her that strength wasn't about being loud, It was about being unmovable. One Friday night, a new waitress started. She was young, barely 19, and looked terrified. A customer, a drunk tourist, made a rude comment about her appearance. The girl froze, tears welling up, looking ready to bolt. Maya was across the room. She saw the girl's fear. She saw the customer's smirk. Maya didn't hesitate. She walked across the floor, her steps heavy and deliberate. She stopped at the table. She didn't shout. She just stood there, channeling the memory of the man in the corner booth. "Sir," Maya said, her voice low and calm, "you pay for what you drink, and you pay for what you say. Apologize to her, or get out." The tourist looked at Maya. He saw the fire in her eyes. He saw the regulars behind her, watching, ready to back her up this time. "Sorry," the man muttered, looking down. Maya turned to the new girl and winked. "You're doing fine," she whispered. "I got your back." Outside, the wind howled across the desert, carrying the dust of 1,000 miles. And if you listened closely, in the low rumble of the highway, you could almost hear the sound of a Harley-Davidson, riding on, leaving a legacy of respect in its wake. The angel was gone, but the rule remained.